Good evening, everybody. Hell's Unicorn here once again. I just got into a little bit of a fairly heated discussion with a Dennis Kucinich enthusiast on a video, and it got me thinking a little bit about something that hadn't really come up for me since around the time that the 2009 Tea Party started to form and people like Michelle Bachmann, Sarah Palin, and Glenn Beck became the so-called anti-establishment types, which I didn't really buy. Nonetheless, there was this looming specter of what direction will the actual legitimate liberty movement go? Would it go the direction of Ron Paul via a more minarchistic free market approach? Or would it be a Dennis Kucinich approach of peace-loving hippies that want to stick it to the man and grow the government big in ways other than militarism kind of movement, so to speak? Back in 2007, when things really started to come to a head and Ron Paul's name really started to get big, I often wondered, to what extent can alliances be formed with people that are tied in with the socialistic Dennis Kucinich side of things? The Bernie Sanders types, and yes, the Alan Grayson types. Alan Grayson, it's really sad. It's really sad about him. Excuse me. The guy had a few issues that he was dead on with regards to, and yet every time he got up and he made a speech on the House floor, he literally killed anything that he had going for him. The guy was such a pompous asshole. He was always in everybody's faces. I just assume if the liberty movement is going to be led by people like that, we might as well just embrace our chains and be done with it, because that's a losing proposition right there. And I think to an extent the same holds true with the Dennis Kucinich camp, but for a different reason. Dennis Kucinich is much more of a conciliar kind of thinker, and he's not as belligerent and not as in-your-face as the Vermont Brahmin, who engages in bromides, Bernie Sanders is. I can respect Dennis Kucinich, even though he's said a few outlandish things and he's made a fool out of himself a couple of times. But ultimately, ideology plays a big part in determining these things. And when you have a person who on one hand states, I love the Constitution, I carry my pocket Constitution with me everywhere, and is also a Second Amendment hating fanatic, things kind of fall apart just right then and there. What good is having a person in office who says he's going to rein in on all the militarism if at the same time he's going to leave us defenseless at the hands of the same government? Doesn't really make sense to me. And in keeping with that also, when you listen to the rhetoric of Kucinich's supporters, we're not really talking about the same revolution here, particularly when it comes to the most basic accepted truths of nature, which is you ought to keep what you earn. Kucinich doesn't believe in this. He's being guided in a very large respect by Roman Catholic politics, the Orthodox medieval kind that is in love with things like zoning and licensing businesses and sticking their hands into your pockets to get at your wallet as opposed to getting into your pants for other things. That's more of a Michael Chertoff and a neoconservative thing, although Obama and Napolitano seem to be just as happy with it. No, Kucinich is kind of a walking contradiction in more respects than just the Second Amendment thing. When you look at Roman Catholic dogma from the Middle Ages, it's pretty easy to understand why there was a Protestant Reformation. And it was all tied around the fact that, on the one hand, greed and envy were considered deadly sins, and yet on the other, they weren't actually sins if you were a member of the clergy and you were engaging in them. There was a different standard for you. And some of that holds true with Mr. Kucinich. He's a man who generally argues that people should keep what they earn unless they are people that he doesn't like. I disagree with the Kucinich people on a number of points. One of the big ones is the ethical nature of a person's wealth is not solely limited to how much he has. If a person has amassed billions of dollars in wealth, he didn't necessarily steal it. You might argue that he might be overcharging his clients with whatever goods and services he's providing, and I would support changing the patent and copyright system to make it easier for generics to come into the market quicker if that be the case. But by the same token, it was through the efforts of industrialist thinkers that allow all of these things to get from the individual's vision to the actual marketplace, so to speak. Dennis Kucinich doesn't understand the market. He understands Romish casuistry, though. Casuistry, I think, is the actual proper pronunciation. It's the same thing that guided the Jesuits. And I'll have to look this up again. I forget what Dennis Kucinich's alma mater is, but I'm willing to bet it was probably the same, similarly Jesuit-tilted one to the one that gave us both Pelosi and John Boehner. And I can't really stomach supporting somebody who's tied in with the Jesuits, even if they do get it right most of the time. I'll make maybe one exception with Pat Buchanan. People often ask me, with your particular theological disposition and, how very consistent you are on it, how can you support anybody who is not in full agreement with your particular views on the matter, your theology, as it were? Truth is there's not a lot of people that actually do concur with them 100%. And I don't know if necessarily that's what it takes to be a good Christian and to be a good public servant. People often ask me, what is there out there that you actually disagree with Ron Paul on? And the truth is, if you're asking in terms of politics, there is pretty much no disagreement that I can think of whatsoever. From marriage licensing, to the drug war, to the right to life, all of this stuff I'm in full agreement with him on. I even agree with his assessment of the death penalty, believe it or not. I believe that there are instances where the death penalty is merited, but I don't think that the government that we have is in any position morally to be justified in executing anyone. Not according to the standards of Old Testament law, where you cannot condemn a person who you yourself are also guilty of the same crime. We've got way too many hypocrites in government to be executing people, in my opinion. If we have somebody one day who actually is a person in good moral standing and doesn't have a ton of skeletons in the closet, and we have a case where I think it rises to a capital offense, I'd support execution, but not here and definitely not now. But there are things, believe it or not, that I do disagree with Ron Paul on. It's stuff that doesn't really matter to most people. Ron Paul's a Baptist. I support infant baptism, And I don't support dunking people's heads in the water. I don't think it's scripturally defensible. Ron Paul's brother, who is actually a Lutheran minister, agrees with me on that one. I don't think that the Baptist Church has a valid form of church government. I don't think that the Congregationalist model lends itself to something where there is actual checks and balances against heresies getting into the church. I don't agree with musical instruments being present in the chapel during worship, which is something that puts me at odds probably with about 95% of Christians in this country, and probably in most of the rest of the world, save perhaps the Orthodox churches over in the Eastern Blocs and certain conservative Presbyterian circles in Scotland. And apparently, I think also the Vatican itself. From what I understand, although the Pope is perfectly fine with there being church organs and other accompanying instruments in chapels and Catholic churches all throughout the world, he actually observes the original chanting of the Psalms that I myself witness in the very small congregation that I belong to. I think, although I'm not sure about this, that the Baptist church that Ron Paul attends is a temperance church, which means they use grape juice instead of wine during the sacrament of the Eucharist and or the Lord's Supper. As far as I'm concerned, that's the equivalent of having a baptism without water. But in this day and age, we're well beyond any notion of somebody of full 100% agreement getting into office and actually being able to affect any kind of change. So these are things that I basically put aside in favor of the bigger picture. And there are certain things that we do need to put aside in the name of the bigger picture. But one of the things that I think we should not put aside is the concept of economic freedom. And I think to an extent we have to understand that while the Kucinich supporters in this country may be valuable allies when it comes to trying to cut down on all of the unnecessary militarism, they're utterly useless when it comes to economics. And I see little reason why we should actually be fellowshipping with these people and calling them our friends. They're not. They're competitors. They just happen to be more likable competitors than the current crop of corrupt SOBs that we have running this country. Well, take from it what you will. With prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.